I remember the day really well. It was December the 4th, 2019. I'd worked as a consultant and trainer for a good many years, and on this particular day I was working with a large automotive group in the Midlands. And as I got back into my car at the end of working with this client, I put my mobile phone into the holder on the dashboard, and immediately there was an incoming call. And I recognised on the screen that that call was coming from Charlotte, who was my son's girlfriend. I can remember her through her really distressed state, just telling me, "I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, Steve, but Jordan's killed himself." All I remember at the end of the call was sitting in the car in utter disbelief, thinking, what do I do? And I must admit, a lot of that is a blank now. I remember calling my family. Can't tell you what order I called those people in. I'm pretty certain I called my wife first. It's really hard to try and recall how I felt at that moment. Clearly there was disbelief. Things were unraveling, and I'd made the calls that I had to make, and now I had to think about this 3.5 hour journey back north, driving home. And the next thing I remember was an incoming call, and Charlotte's name appeared on the screen, and I assumed it was Charlotte calling me back. In fact, it was a female police officer using Charlotte's phone. And I remember this female police officer introduced herself. She said she was at Jordan's house. And I just remember the first question she asked me was, "Do you have a funeral director?" And I can remember the thought going through my head, this is real, this is actually happening. No, I don't have a funeral director. Does everybody have a funeral director? And I think at that moment when that question was asked of me, the reality of the situation really started to sink in. The following day we went to visit Jordan's house, and I remember the house sits at the end of a small cul-de-sac, and as we turned the corner, the first thing that greeted us was the boarded up window at the front of the house. I remember as we parked the car up and I got out and went to the front door and put the key in the door. I remember the hesitation and the trepidation as I walked in, and then we were standing in the hallway where Jordan had taken his life. I remember as I walked into the kitchen, on the kitchen table was a half-empty glass of water, and then a bowl with a spoon in it. And as I got closer, I realised that it was the remnants of Jordan's final breakfast. It was a half-eaten bowl of porridge, the porridge now congealed on the spoon. I seem to remember just standing in the kitchen with tears rolling down my face and just looking at this sight, Jordan's last breakfast, the note on the table, all these things, looking back into the hall where he chose to take his own life. It's just a feeling of numbness and disbelief. There's no thought process really. It's just utter desolation really at that moment in time. Also on the kitchen table, I spotted a small wallet. I picked it up and looked inside. There were no credit cards, there's no cash, there was just a few coins. And so where were his credit cards, and where was his mobile phone? But more importantly, where was Jordan? Where had they taken him? When could we see him? I knew that somebody had to take responsibility. I knew that I had to start getting answers to these questions. And from that point began a process of several days that I can only describe as a living hell as we tried to find out where Jordan was. I knew I needed to contact the police officer who had phoned me on my journey home. Charlotte had a mobile number and gave that to me, and I called the police officer. It went straight through to voicemail. So I decided to text her, explain who I was, and could she tell me where Jordan was? And it must have been at least 24 hours. I've kind of lost track of time, that I tried again and similarly just didn't get a response. So now I called West Yorkshire Police, and no one was really able to help me in terms of who the officer was dealing with the case. And I received a response telling me that the WPC was on annual leave. So the next thing I did was, I thought, well, let's go to the closest police station to where Jordan lived, near Horsforth in Leeds. So I got in my car and I drove to the police station, and I spoke to the desk sergeant and told him who I was. I remember standing amongst a group of Chinese students who were all there with their visas, maybe to get their visas approved. And there's me looking for my son who's taken his own life amongst a group of 20 students. It just seemed the most surreal of situations. Once I had the detective sergeant's information, I was able to speak to him on the phone. The guy was very reassuring, I have to say. He was very sympathetic, and I finally felt like we were speaking to someone who might be able to help us. He advised me that the coroner would be in touch, and sure enough, on the third or fourth day, I think it was, we heard from the coroner, and they explained that the process in being able to view Jordan or take things forward could take 10 days to 2 weeks. I just couldn't believe that we couldn't see our son for that period of time. You know, days are passing now. We didn't even know where he was. So I think finally, I think the coroner took some pity on us, I think, given the distress we were in, and advised us that Jordan was at Leeds Royal Infirmary in the mortuary there. And finally that day came where we all went to see Jordan. I remember as the door opened and he asked us if we wanted to go in one at a time or two at a time, and I remember us looking at each other saying, what do we do here? And then that moment when you walk into the room and you see your son effectively sleeping, and he looked so peaceful, and yet you knew, and I knew at that moment, that my son was dead. He'd taken his own life, and he's lying there before me. Throughout all this, one of the things that struck me was, where was the support for us as a bereaved family? It was me that was having to drive around police stations. It was me that was having to phone coroners' offices and funeral directors and deal with Jordan's affairs. And there seemed to be no automatic support for us as a family. And I remember talking to a good friend about this, and he said, you should document what's happening. He said, you should write down everything that's happening to you at the moment. One day you're going to need this, maybe just to reflect and look back on, but maybe as evidence even for what you're going through at the moment. And it was at that point that I started to journal and started to write down my experiences, not only what was happening to us, but also what I was feeling. Because one of the things that started to happen to me was I started to not only not sleep well at night, but I started to get physical symptoms as a reaction of the shock and trauma from losing Jordan. I would get my body jerking in convulsions at times every time I thought about what had happened, or even just spontaneously. My head would twitch from one side to another, just involuntary, and it would happen really quite often. And even now on occasions when I'm stressed and think about what's happened, that momentarily will happen. So I started to journal. I started to make notes. And 3 weeks later, I thought, am I the only person? Are we the only family going through this? So on December the 16th, just 3 weeks later, I published an article titled, "The Day My Son Took His Own Life." My finger hovered over the publish button for probably 5 minutes saying, Steve, why are you really sharing this? And then it dawned on me that if this article would help one person, that they would understand the impact of suicide on those that are left behind and this huge ripple effect. If that stopped one person from doing this, then I absolutely had to share this story. And so I pressed the publish button. And then during the following hours and days and weeks, I started to get increasing numbers of responses and reactions and comments, many of them from people that I knew who were showing great sympathy and care for me. And then I get messages from further afield, from other countries. Some of them were from psychologists who had read my article and the way I'd explained the process and what we were going through in a way that they'd never been able to explain, because often their papers were too theoretical. But I'd really explained the pain how distraught we were, this devastating impact on us as a family. And then I started to get messages from people who had lost loved ones themselves to suicide, and I realised that I wasn't on my own anymore. And then the bit that maybe I hadn't expected, I started to get messages from people who were considering suicide or had attempted, and in some ways were reaching out because of my story for help. And it was at that moment that I suddenly realised that I needed to provide some kind of response for those people, because I clearly wasn't a mental health expert. What was I supposed to say? How was I supposed to respond to these people? What if I say the wrong thing and they decide to go and take their own life? I had to understand more about suicide. I had to be able to respond to these people in a way that helped and supported them and gave them hope. Through that expertise that we had in the family, we started to create a response in terms of signposting people where they could go to, particularly if they were in a crisis and needed help. As the weeks went by, we of course went back to Jordan's house many times. We had to deal with his belongings, and it was as we went through his belongings that we discovered journals that Jordan had written. They were partially completed, but they went back 4 or 5 years. And I remember we looked at one particular entry from May of 2015 where Jordan had actually written the words, "I've been researching methods of suicide again today. I've discovered this particular method, but it's quite a difficult process." And it was hard. You imagine that yes, your son's taken his own life, but that was surely a spontaneous thing under stress at that moment in time. Surely it wasn't something he's been planning for years, but there it was documented from 5 years earlier. So this was clearly something that had been on Jordan's mind for years. Clearly what we were starting to build a picture of was a young lad in pain and in torment. And we know in the end, because of the note that he wrote to Charlotte and the note that he wrote to myself and his mum and his sister, when he said, "Forgive me what I'm going to do. I know this is going to hurt you, but this is the only way that I can escape the thoughts that are literally showing me no way out." The one thing I've kept asking myself was, if Jordan was considering suicide all those years ago, why didn't he do that then? Why wait all this time? And I think the clue was probably in the line that he wrote in that note to us, that he wanted to escape the pain. He didn't want to die. And I've learned this since with so many people who have chosen to take their own lives or attempted to and survived, that at the moment they choose to take their lives, they realize they want to live. So this is not about simply wanting to die and not being here anymore. This is about escaping the pain they're suffering themselves or the pain they're putting on other people. The more that I started to share my story on LinkedIn, and the more conversations I started to have with people who'd lost loved ones to suicide, and even those that were thinking of taking their own lives, one thing became really clear, that most of these people didn't want to die. Most of these people wanted to live, but they wanted someone to listen to them. They just wanted someone to sit down with them and hold their hand and let them share their story, let them share their pain in a way where they wouldn't be judged, but they could openly just talk about what they were going through. And it was at that point that I realized that I had a voice, I had an audience that would listen, and that I knew if I created something to allow people to talk more openly about suicide and mental health, then maybe, just maybe, I could make a difference. And it was in March of 2020 that the idea came to me of creating the Jordan Legacy. We created a website, we started to signpost people where they could get help and support, from counselling to therapists, to sharing stories from lived experience from others that had been through similar situations. The website started to grow and we started to build a following. But the important thing here is that by sharing my story and by others sharing their story, we're able to give hope to people that it's okay to talk about mental health. It's okay to talk about suicide. So all I'd ask as a father who's lost his son to suicide, if you are contemplating doing the same and taking a permanent solution to what is a temporary problem, sit down with your loved one, Tell them how you're feeling. Let them listen to you. They'll listen without judgment. Just ask them to do that for you. And if you do that, you'll be able to receive the help that you need, because there is hope. There is hope for you to live a fulfilling life, because once you make that decision to take your life, there is no coming back. So give your loved ones that opportunity, please, to allow you to live that fulfilling life that you deserve.